In our village, they say that when a person is meant for something greater, the spirits watch over them from birth. We did not know, back then, that Nick was one such person. She was a quiet child, her beauty understated by the humility she carried, even as the daughter of our wealthiest elder, Oz, who was known beyond the village for his vast land and influence. Her father, a man who had built an empire with his own hands, had raised her to be different from the children of other prominent families. While his wealth could have granted her anything: fine clothes, a large home, and endless comforts, Nick chose the simple life. She insisted on living in the village hostel rather than in the large, ornate house her father had built for her in the town's elite section. She wore the simplest clothes, nothing extravagant, always careful not to stand out. People around here loved her for that, though they didn't fully understand why she shied away from the luxury that could have been hers. It was said she had inherited her mother's wisdom, a woman whose quiet strength spoke louder than words. But even in her humble ways, the shadow of her father's wealth lingered. People would often talk about her in hushed tones, wondering why a girl like her, with so much to offer, didn't flaunt her status. But Nick was always more interested in the people, the village children, the elders, the way we all lived together. She would spend hours talking to the older women about herbal remedies, sitting by the fire as they ground yam or made porridge. It was an ordinary afternoon, and the village was abuzz with talk of a new building coming up in the town center. Nick's father, Oz, had commissioned the construction of a new complex for his businesses. As usual, Nick was quiet and kept to herself. Yet something was off that day. I remember it well. I was sitting by the elders' fire when Nick arrived, her face pale and set. She was normally composed, but there was something about her eyes that told a different story. "I saw a young man," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He was standing at the edge of the river bridge. I think he was going to jump." That was the first time I heard the name Timmy. It wasn't long before we learned that the young man, Timmy, had lost everything. His building, his dream, a business venture he had worked on tirelessly for years, had been demolished. The land dispute over the property had gone to court, and the court had ruled against him. His world, as he knew it, had crumbled. As the village watched, Nick rushed out of the compound, her feet carrying her through the winding paths, despite the heavy weight of the news. She went to find Timmy. She didn't hesitate to help. I followed behind her, partly because the villagers were buzzing with excitement, and partly because I wanted to see what would happen. We found Timmy at the bridge, standing, lost in thought, staring at the turbulent river below. He was tall and thin, his face a mix of exhaustion and despair. "Why are you doing this?" Nick asked gently, her voice carrying the kindness of 1,000 mothers. Timmy turned, his eyes empty, as if the light in him had already dimmed. "There's nothing left for me," he said, choking on his words. "The building, everything I worked for is gone." Nick stepped closer, her presence calm, like the stillness of the river at dawn. "Your life is worth more than a moment," she said, "and I may not know your pain, but I know that ending it here won't solve anything." Something in her voice reached him. He stepped away from the edge, shaking. That was the first of many times Timmy's life would be saved by Nick's quiet strength. Nick brought Timmy back to her father's house, where Oz agreed to help him. I watched from the corner of my eye as Nick's father opened doors that could have only been opened by a man of great power. Timmy was given new opportunities, contacts, resources, the chance to rebuild. Nick remained by his side, offering guidance and support, a constant reminder of what true friendship and loyalty looked like. I think that was when Timmy began to fall in love with her, though at the time, I couldn't have predicted how their bond would grow. What was most striking to me, however, was how quickly the balance of power shifted. In a matter of months, Timmy's tech startup exploded, attracting investors and turning his small dream into a thriving business. It was said that Nick was the quiet force behind his success, Her advice was often the calm in the chaos. But as his business grew, so did the distance between them. One day, a woman came into the picture. Her name was Miwa, a tall, elegant figure with an air of superiority. She was a businesswoman of sorts, but there was something about her that made people uneasy. Nick didn't like her. She didn't trust her. Miwa started showing up at the office, showering Timmy with extravagant gifts and invitations. The villagers could sense the tension. Nick's once unwavering calm was now replaced by uncertainty. And while Timmy remained polite and distant, something about Miwa's presence disturbed the air. Nick didn't say much, but I could see it in her eyes. The same unease that she felt in Miwa's presence was mirrored in the way she carried herself. Timmy reassured her over and over, but the distance between them grew. And then, the unthinkable happened. It was on a quiet morning when Nick received the call. Her father, Oz, the great Oz, whose influence could bend the world to his will, had been kidnapped. My heart sank when I saw the look on her face, pale and broken. The voice on the phone told her there was only one way to save her parents' lives: 200 million naira, in cash, within 72 hours. No police, or they would die. Nick didn't waste a moment. She arranged for the money, negotiated with people I could not even dream of knowing. But despite her desperate efforts, when the money was paid, her parents were not released. I remember when she returned to the village after hearing the news. Her feet dragged, her once strong posture now bent, as if the weight of the world had collapsed on her shoulders. The village was silent as she passed by, our hearts breaking for her, though we had no words. Nick buried her parents in a small ceremony that reflected their simple lives. Yet the vultures were already circling. Her uncles, those men she once thought of as family, came and seized everything her father had built. Documents appeared, claiming her father had left no will. The land, the wealth, it all disappeared. As if fate had cursed her, Timmy, the man she had helped so selflessly, began to distance himself. The woman he had once seen as a savior now seemed like an inconvenience. The once kind man had turned cold, and Miwa's shadow hung over their relationship. But what was most painful, what cut her to the bone, was how he treated her when she had nothing left. He told her she was a liability, that without her father's wealth, she meant nothing. The anger I felt watching this was unmatched. I could see it in Nick's eyes: hurt, confusion, and the realization that love was never what she thought it was. The man she had once cared for was now treating her as if she were less than dust. But Nick had been through too much to break. She left him, leaving behind the cold walls of his mansion and stepping into the unknown. I wish I could say it was the end of her story, but it wasn't. Nick found herself staying with a humble guard from a neighboring estate. His name was Adu, a simple man who worked hard to feed his family and tend to his responsibilities. Nick, though broken, never lost her dignity. And then, in a twist that no one saw coming, she found the strength to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Her father's will, which everyone believed was non-existent, surfaced, and with it, the truth came out. The wealth and empire were hers. Nick had inherited